Okay, I'm going to be talking about Freud's essay on the uncanny, um, and his definition of uncanny is a little hard to wrap your head around, but we don't have to walk through the entire thing that he does with definitions, but it's laid out pretty clearly before he starts quoting all the dictionaries. On the left-hand side of 515, he writes, "The uncanny is that class of the frightening which leads back to what is known and known of old and long familiar." And then when he does start listing the definitions, he describes Heimlich as part of that definition is familiar, Heimlich, not Heimlich, and then unheimlich, I'm sorry, still part of the definition of Heimlich is concealed. And he wants to talk about how concealed and familiar work together, so that familiar seems like something we're used to and we come across all the time, but concealed seems like something that's hidden, and maybe even hidden from us, or at least our conscious selves. So Heimlich is, or unheimlich, is something that is not known, but suddenly not concealed. And the definition or the translation of that is uncanny. He goes on to talk about the story of the Sandman, which we don't need to pay a whole bunch of attention to. And then he gives us some examples of how this works. The two examples I'm going to use for my examples right now are the omnipotence of thought and the belief in immortality. These, he says, we had before we developed an ego, before we transcended our desires of the id. These were operatives. So when we were babies, we had this belief in our own immortality. And we had this belief that what we wanted, that we could do anything with our thoughts, that we were omnipotent. So, for example, this turns out not to be true, probably, but a baby might think if he kicks his legs, that makes the curtains blow. So he'll do it again and the curtains blow. That would be omnipotence of thought. So these are concealed. They live only in our unconscious. When we are reminded of them by things in our consciousness, then we experience them as uncanny. What is concealed is suddenly now familiar. So I'm going to show you these two examples that I got to write on my board. Oops. So the omnipotence of thought, meaning I can do anything I want, lands us in a repetition compulsion, but also renders coincidences uncanny. A belief in immortality renders doppelgangers or doubling uncanny. Doppelganger means double walker in German. We talk about doppelgangers all the time in literature. The best example that I know of is in Frankenstein, where Dr. Frankenstein and the creature are doppelgangers. They sort of are two sides of the same coin. That and doubles remind us of our belief in immortality, because the doubling seems to suggest that even if one died, there would still be more left or something. A good example of this is identical twins. We might experience as uncanny, the way you would find it uncanny if there were twins, and I hope there are no identical twins in class, but let's say one died and then you saw the other one and it looked like your friend. Hey, James. Hi. Then that would be an uncanny experience. if you had a series of coincidences that, like he says, the number that repeats over and over again, then that would remind you of when you thought you could control everything. Those examples would be both familiar because they were happening in the real world, and unfamiliar because they reminded you of things that you had concealed. When they're concealed and when they're familiar, they become unheimlich. And this weird story that he tells, or these weird things that we experience as uncanny, are things in the world that remind us of things we have repressed. It happens to be the case that a lot of these things occur in literature, and we think of uncanny literature as maybe as a whole sort of subgenre. Okay, I will see you in class.